I hope you enjoy this hero's journey into the realm of philosophy, psychology, and physics. If you want to help me create more content like this, please subscribe and consider sponsoring me here on YouTube. I also want to thank the Platonic Mystery School of the Divine Infinite Being for sponsoring this course, and you can check that school out at divineinfinitebeing.com. The Heart of Nature, Joyful Self-Expansion. So we're continuing in Ernest Becker's book, The Denial of Death. Here he's describing what seems to be a fundamental fact about the cosmos itself and the human being's place in it. He says, it is as though the heart of nature is pulsating in its own joyful self-expansion. He, meaning the human species, can pulsate and expand both organismically and symbolically. So Ernest Becker has distilled 20th century psychology down to what he calls the still towering Kierkegaard's realization that for a human being to be fulfilled, we need to take a leap of faith by virtue of the absurd in the apparently absurd belief that an infinitely powerful God loves finite humans infinitely. I'm arguing that it's much easier to take that leap of faith in light of the equation Psyche equals Singularity, which can quell a lot of the skepticism that emerges in a scientifically educated mind, which is everyone's mind in the 21st century, at least anyone who's been raised with at least a bare minimum of the standards of education in the Western world. We've been taught mostly that life comes from random combinations of insentient material atoms that float around in 3 dimensions of rigid empty space. It's a combination of Newton's mechanistic physics and Darwin's biological theory of evolution. In that paradigm, the fundamental need for a human being to believe that we are eternal servants of an omniscient, omnipotent God seems superstitious. And as that belief in God has been rejected as such by many of the most intelligent people in academia for the past couple of 100 years, but after the evolution of physics in the 20th century, I'm saying it's unreasonable to believe that consciousness is a byproduct of these little bits of matter, because those little bits of matter don't even exist according to quantum mechanics. When you observe them, they act like little particles. When you're not observing them, they act like immaterial waves of probability for where a particle might exist when you do observe it. Little bits of so-called matter behave much more like ideas in a mind than cogs in a machine, as Newton's paradigm would have us believe, even though Isaac Newton himself did believe in God. So at any rate, following Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli's theory that the laws of physics mirror the laws of psychology because mind and matter emerge from the archetypal self, all of these psychological desires that the psychologists unearthed through over a century of clinical analysis make sense if Psyche equals Singularity. This joyful self-expansion that seems to be inherent in the universe makes a lot of sense if the gravitational singularity is the archetypal self. So continuing in this slide, the heart of nature is the gravitational singularity, the omnicentric archetype of the self, from which space-time exploded at the Big Bang, and from which it continues to expand at an accelerating rate, caused by the dark energy of the quantum vacuum, created by the constant creation and annihilation of virtual particle-antiparticle pairs. So this joyful self-expansion. To claim that the heart of nature is pulsating with its own joyful self-expansion makes a lot more sense if the gravitational singularity is the heart of nature. According to the current Big Bang theory, the initial bang was a period called the inflationary period, in which all of space-time expanded at an incredible rate, the first Planck second of time, and then it slowed down, but even though the acceleration rate slowed down, the universal expansion is accelerating over time. In 1998, Saul Perlmutter discovered that, studying images from the Hubble Space Telescope. So the gravitational singularity at the Big Bang also exists at each point of the quantum vacuum, as we've discussed, and at each point of the cosmic horizon. The constant acceleration of the expansion of the cosmos caused by the quantum vacuum is therefore caused by the omnicentric singularity, according to Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles. The singularity at the Big Bang is identical to the singularity at every point in the quantum vacuum underlying every point of three-dimensional space, and it's identical to every singularity out at the horizon of the cosmos. It's identical to all of the singularities inside all of the black holes strewn throughout the three-dimensional volume of space. And its nature is to expand. Two opposite motives of man. e pluribus unum, e unum pluribus. So the fundamental driving force of the human psyche, according to Ernest Becker's analysis of 20th century psychology, is the fear of death and the need to deny death by perceiving ourselves as immortal heroes serving God at a cosmic scale. Now, after that initial compulsion to deny death, we have two other motives which point in opposite directions. E pluribus unum, from many one. That was the original slogan of the United States of America. And e unum pluribus, from one many. So let me just read what Becker says. The paradox takes the form of two motives or urges that seem to be part of creature consciousness and that point in two opposite directions. On the one hand, the creature is impelled by a powerful desire to identify with the cosmic process, to merge himself with the rest of nature. On the other hand, he wants to be unique, to stand out as something different and apart. Then beneath that I have conscious-unconscious equals singularity horizon and Atman equals Brahman. So psyche equals singularity is the fundamental equation upon which this class is based, but each side of that equation can be broken down into its own fundamental pair of opposites. Psyche consists of the polarity between the conscious and the unconscious, and the singularity is the opposite pole of the gravitational singularity, is the horizon of the cosmos. I equate the conscious ego with the omnicentric singularity, and I equate the collective unconscious that contains all of the archetypes of knowledge with the holographic horizon of the cosmos. The urge to merge ourselves and lose our identity by uniting with everything else correlates to merging with the horizon of the cosmos, and the urge to stand out as something different and apart correlates to the omnicentric singularity, the conscious ego side of the self. Atman equals Brahman. Atman is the particular personal soul, and Brahman is the impersonal wave nature of the soul that merges in the ocean of precognitive bliss. Atman correlates to the singularity, it correlates to the particle nature. The material world and the psychic world mirror each other, then the Atman equals Brahman equation is reflected in the particle wave nature at the ground level of the material world. So we'll develop this theme in these next few slides. Agape merger, close union with a God ideal. So according to Becker's analysis of the 20th century psychologist, each person wants a sense of self-expansion in a larger beyond, a feeling of kinship with the all, a self beyond his own self, in order to know who he is at all, in order to feel that he belongs to the universe. Otto Rank said, for only by living in a close union with a God ideal that has been erected outside one's own ego is one able to live at all. Returning to Becker's own words, he says, perhaps this natural expansion of the creature alone can explain why transference is such a universal passion. From this point of view, too, we understand the idea of God as a logical fulfillment of the agape side of man's nature. So we have two motives. Once we surpass the most basic motive of the fear of death and the need to deny death, we have two other motives. One is to merge with all of nature, and the other is to stand out as a unique individual. And both of them are related to this desire for expansion. I'll continuously point out the parallels between that psychology of the self, which Becker claims to have distilled to its fundamental ingredients, and the physics of the gravitational singularity. Is it just a coincidence that these laws of physics of the singularity so perfectly mirror the psychological laws that govern the human mind? Even if it is just a coincidence, still, according to Otto Rank, we need to believe in God in order to live at all. So, if our survival depends on it, then we want to choose the fiction that's most believable, and lo and behold, Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli, Jung being the brightest mind in psychology in my opinion, and Pauli certainly being one of the brightest minds in physics, present us with a theory that the laws of physics and psychology mirror each other because mind and matter emerge from the archetypal self, and that theory, presented by these two geniuses, perfectly fulfills all of the desires of the human psyche that Becker claims to have distilled by studying 20th century psychology. Even if it isn't true, even if the psyche isn't the singularity, even if there is no such thing as a gravitational singularity as Einstein himself believed, nevertheless, if we do need to believe that there is a God, this is the theory that's most likely to convince a 21st century mind that has been educated in at least the basics of the evolution of science since Isaac Newton. Individuating eros, we all shine on. He can expand his self-feeling not only by agape merger, but also by the other ontological motive, eros. the urge for more life, for the development of the self-powers, for developing the uniqueness of the individual creature, the impulsion to stick out of nature and shine. Life is a fascinating opportunity to expand. So the agape merger correlates to the wave nature or the Brahman nature of the psyche. We want to lose our individuality by merging and uniting with everything around us. The eros nature, the eros compulsion of the human psyche wants to shine on and stick out as the #1 actor on the world stage. Continuing with the slide, the eros motive correlates to the conscious ego pole of the collective unconscious archetype of the self, the central singularity, as opposed to the encompassing horizon, agape. Each of us is the center of an expanding universe, a miniature Big Bang, sticking out of nature and shining forth infinitely brightly. So here is a quote from John Lennon's song Instant Karma. Who on the earth do you think you are? A superstar? Well, right you are. Well, we all shine on like the moon and the stars and the sun. So that's a great song. If you listen to that song in the context of this class, I think you'll appreciate the song even more. It seems to me it would be a suitable theme song for this entire class. We have this compulsion to stick out and be special, to be a hero on the cosmic stage for God. The easiest way to convince ourselves that that is true, that we all do shine on like the moon and the stars and the sun, I'm arguing is to identify ourselves with the omnicentric singularity, which exists everywhere. At the quantum vacuum, at the horizon of the cosmos, in the center of the universe, which is everywhere from anyone's perspective. Anywhere you go in the universe, from your perspective, you will be the center from which everything else is expanding at an accelerating rate. Eros and agape, Atman equals Brahman. So considering how fundamental this is, Becker says this Eros and agape, these urges are the most basic urges of the human psyche. The most basic urge is the fear of death and the need to deny death. And then just above that, the two directions of our desires for how to live are to merge with everything and to stick out as a unique superstar. So it's worth reiterating this fundamental point. Atman equals Brahman. So Eros, the Eros desire is fulfilled identifying ourselves with Atman, the particular individual soul. The agape urge to merge with everything is satisfied by equating ourselves with Brahman, a wave in the ocean of potential being. So this picture on the left is the two-slit experiment, which in 1927 physicists conducted and discovered that at the quantum level, particles act like particles when you observe them. They act like waves of probability when you don't. We'll go over that most basic experiment of quantum mechanics after I read through this slide. We are outside of decaying and dying nature in two opposite but complementary ways that correlate to the wave-particle paradox of quantum mechanics. We are each merged as a wave in the impersonal ocean of potential being Brahman, the quantum vacuum, which is equivalent to the cosmic horizon, both of which are infinitely hot and carpeted with singularities. In some inconceivable way, we simultaneously stand outside of nature as an eternal individual personality, a subsidiary and subservient singularity, a unique Atman participating in the universal expansion of the supreme Atman, Paramatman, Achintya Beta Beta Tattva. So that phrase, Achintya Beta Beta Tattva, comes from Chaitanya, who founded the Gaudiya Vaishnava school of Vedanta in the 16th century in India, in Bengal. That's where the word Gaudiya Vaishnavism comes from. We are inconceivably simultaneously individual particles of personal consciousness, Atman, and impersonal waves in the ocean of Brahman. I equate the collective unconscious side of the self with Brahman, which I also equate with the holographic horizon of the cosmos and the underlying quantum vacuum, because both of them are made of tightly packed singularities, which, according to Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles, are all one. So let me now just review this two-slit experiment, which is one of the most important things you need to understand in order to get the full value of this class. So, in the 1920s, physicists noticed that at the smallest scale, matter sometimes acts like it's made of particles and sometimes it acts like it's made of waves. So they conducted this experiment to find out exactly what it is. If electrons, one of the fundamental constituent parts of an atom, if electrons are particles, then they could shoot an electron gun at a wall with two slits placed very close to each other and place a detector screen behind the two slits. If the electrons are little particles, then like bullets shot from a machine gun, they should line up in two bands directly behind the two slits, like you see at the top part of the picture here. If electrons are waves, then the wave would hit both slits at the same time. Two new little waves would ripple out from each slit, and as those waves, like little half circles, expanded outward, they would interfere with each other and create a ripple pattern. The peaks and valleys of these two intersecting waves would cancel each other out, creating a blank spot where there'd be no measurable impact. And then the peaks, if they were to merge, would amplify themselves. I think also the valleys. At any rate, what you would see is this interference pattern of a series of bands stretched out across the entire detector screen. So when they did the experiment, something that no one expected occurred. Each of the electrons was detected by the detector screen as a particular hit, but sometimes the particles would hit way off to the right, sometimes way off to the left, sometimes directly behind the slits. But after about an hour, the pattern of individual particle hits on the detector screen came out to look exactly like a wave, as if a wave had gone through all at once and created the interference pattern. So then they decided, well, let's put an electron microscope at the two slits and see which ones it goes through. When they did that, the little electrons lined up directly behind the slits like well-behaved little particles. So the implication was that when you're observing entities at the quantum scale, they act like little particles. But when you're not observing them, they act like waves. But they are not material waves, they're mathematical waves of probability, and the probability is for where a particle is likely to appear if it was to be observed or measured. The detector screen is measuring or observing these electrons. That's why they're always detected as little individual particles. When no one's detecting which of the slits they go through, they therefore go through as waves. They travel just like a physical wave, but it's not a physical wave. That's what's so mind-bending about quantum mechanics. What is a mathematical wave of probability? Another implication of the wave of probability is that each of those particles manifests as a separate parallel universe. When in our universe a particle collapses to one point within that wave of probability, automatically a series of other universes emerge in which the only difference between ours and those is the position of that one individual particle in that one wave of probability, so that those miniature little differences, when you extrapolate them outward, turn into macroscopic historical differences, leading, for example, Leonard Susskind to ask, what if the Nazis had won World War II? Every conceivable combination of atoms does occur in one universe or another, and therefore every conceivable historical scenario does occur in one universe or another, which has huge implications for philosophical questions, such as free will versus determinism, as I've discussed before. But the point is, if you identify the psyche with the gravitational singularity, the singularity itself, being a quantum particle, is simultaneously an individual point of personal consciousness and an impersonal wave in the ocean of Brahman. Observer-created personality. We need attention to exist. We want to be recognized as heroes by others because our existence as quantum particles of personality depends on it, just as material particles depend on being observed to draw them up from the waves of probability. So if the psyche is a gravitational singularity, then it only behaves as an individual point of personal consciousness when it's being observed. Can we observe ourselves? Self-realization? Yes. I think that draws us up from the waves, but at the same time, so does being observed by other people. Continuing with the slide, ultimately, we yearn to be recognized by God as a cosmic hero for drawing God's attention as equivalent to drawing the attention of every other Atman simultaneously, which alone enables any individual Atman to achieve the fullest intensity and consolidation of its inherently infinite self-powers. That's a quote from Ernest Becker. So, this class is subtitled A Hero's Journey Through Philosophy, Psychology, and Physics. We want to be a hero. It's natural to want attention if our existence as individual, conscious, subjective personalities depends on being observed. But the human imagination, as Becker points out, the symbolic self, is infinite. It has no limits, and therefore its desire for attention is limitless. You will never be satisfied with the attention that you can receive from other human beings. Even if every other human being and all of the animals fawned on you and worshipped you on the earth, The Earth is just one tiny speck in this galaxy, which is just one tiny speck in the universe, which is just one tiny speck in the multiverse. It will not satisfy the ultimate infinite desire for attention, which can only be satisfied by believing that God, the infinitely powerful, omnipresent, and omniscient personality of Godhead, is observing us and appreciating our cosmic heroics. That makes sense if Psyche equals singularity, given the fact of the quantum mechanical law of observer-created reality. Life-enhancing illusion, performing cosmic heroics for God. So here's a quote from Becker's book. If transference is a natural function of heroism, a necessary projection in order to stand life, death, and oneself, the question becomes, what is creative projection? What is life-enhancing illusion? So, if transference or projection of your unconscious mind onto other people is a natural function of heroism, and you want to be a hero who is appreciated by other people who are worthy of your heroics, and the one person who's most worthy of your heroics is God, if that is the nature of the human psyche, and if we need to believe in God in order to project all of our unconscious impulses onto God, then the question becomes, what is creative projection? What is life-enhancing illusion? So if there is no God, then we still need to believe in God in order to survive. That is one of Becker's fundamental themes throughout his book. He doesn't say there is no God, he doesn't say that there is a God. I do believe in God, but I'm teaching this class from two perspectives. One, that there is a God, the other, that even if there isn't a God, still, if we believe Psyche equals singularity, we can satisfy the human psychology, which demands that a God does exist. And even people like me who fully believe in God are always going to have at least an occasional seed of doubt. And when that little bit of doubt arises, for me it's easy to silence the doubt by just reminding myself of all of the synchronicities that I've experienced, the meaningful coincidences, which we'll be discussing near the end of this class. But in addition to those very personal, meaningful coincidences, which I interpret as messages from God, there is Jung and Pauli's theory of the mirror symmetry between physics and psychology. It seems so precise when we compare Susskind's holographic string theory with Jung's transpersonal psychology that it quells the rational doubt. But just for the sake of argument, let's just assume that there is no God. Nevertheless, we need to believe in God's. What is creative projection? What would be the best, most life-enhancing illusion to believe in to enable ourselves to expand heroically and believe that we're being observed and appreciated by God? I'm arguing that in our current point in history, the most life-enhancing illusion is the Psyche equals singularity equation. I don't believe it's an illusion. Also, it depends on how you define illusion, which we will be discussing, the difference between Yoga Maya and Mahamaya according to Vedanta philosophy. Even if there is a God, you must necessarily relate to God from your own unique subjective perspective. It's not an objective experience. And what's the difference between subjective and objective experiences? Those are all fundamental philosophical questions. But at any rate, continuing with the slide, here's another quote from Becker's book. One goes through it all to arrive at faith. The faith that one's very creatureliness has some meaning to a creator, that despite one's true insignificance, weakness, death, one's existence has meaning in some ultimate sense because it exists within an eternal and infinite scheme of things brought about and maintained to some kind of design by some creative force. Again and again throughout his writings, Kierkegaard repeats the basic formula of faith. One is a creature who can do nothing, but one exists over against a living God for whom everything is possible. God as perfect transference object, but abstractions will never do. Continuing with Becker's book, he says, how can a human being be a God-like everything to another? No human relationship can bear the burden of godhood, and the attempt has to take its toll in some ways on both parties. The reasons are not far to seek. The thing that makes God the perfect spiritual object is precisely that he is abstract, as Hegel saw. We'll be discussing Hegel at length later in the class. Continuing with the slide, on the other hand, Becker also quotes Philip Rieff, who said, abstractions will never do. God terms have to be exemplified. Men crave their principles incarnate in enactable characters, actual selective mediators between themselves and the polytheism of experience. So we need to project our image of God outward. And usually the human being projects that image onto other human beings, beginning with your parents when you're a child. And then when you grow up, you project that God archetype that's in your collective unconscious mind onto other people, political leaders or religious leaders, or rock and roll stars, or whoever it is, some celebrities. We worship them like gods because we are projecting our own God archetype onto them. But they can never fully satisfy our desire to relate with an omnipotent God. Now, God is the perfect spiritual object for transference or projection because, on the one hand, God is abstract. The idea of God being like an empty vessel can absorb any unconscious projections that you can throw on God. From that perspective, is an infinite blank slate. But on the other hand, people want their God incarnate in an individual form with particular characteristics. The picture here is all of the various symbols of the world's religions. Christianity has Jesus Christ. That symbol to the right of that is the Om symbol, and that's got all kinds of spiritual forms to whom you can, or in whom you can project your God archetype. In this class, the Hindu form of God we focus on most is Krishna. Next to that's the Star of David. With Judaism, you've got the prophets. So the point is, you need to believe in God because God is the perfect transference object, according to Becker's analysis of 20th century physics we are accepting as true in this class. But you need to have a God with personal characteristics. Now there is a big problem. So in this class I'm not arguing in favor of any particular religion. I believe the Psyche equals Singularity equation can help people believe in all of the various religions. But it's just important to keep in mind that the goal of this class is to help people take a leap of faith that enables us to surrender ourselves completely to the idea of God. But what idea of God is that? And then we have this union of opposites. On the one hand, God is the infinitely abstract God archetype who can absorb any projection. On the other hand, to have a real personal relationship, you have to have some kind of incarnate form of God. And we'll be discussing that as this class continues. A great firm dome of ignorance. So that's a quote from Friedrich Nietzsche's The Will to Power, which we will come to in a moment. But we'll begin with another quote from Becker's book. Man must always imagine and believe in a second reality or a better world than the one that is given him by nature. As Otto Rank said, with the truth one cannot live. To be able to live, one needs illusions. So another book, Man's Search for Meaning, I was going to include in the class, but it was already expanding beyond a manageable size, so I left it out. But in order to live, human beings need to believe we have a meaningful life, that there's meaning in the universe. If you believe it's all meaningless, then it's hard to survive. Why suffer through the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune if we just live in some random hiccup of cosmic slop that resulted in this accident of human consciousness? We need to believe that there is some ultimate eternal design and purpose for things, and that the cause for which we are living is of infinite significance. And that belief is only possible if you believe in God. We need illusions in order to live. So what is the appropriate illusion? The appropriate illusion is belief in God. The word illusion implies false, or seeing something not the way it is in reality, but in a different way. I do believe in God, but even so, according to Vedanta philosophy, the highest relationship you can have with God is under the veil of Yoga Maya, the spiritual illusion, when you relate with God, but you forget that God is God, and you interact with God on one of the innumerable spiritual planets, just like another person. But you love God fully. Everything that you do in life is absorbed in your relationship with God, but that relationship, again, is covered with this veil of Yoga Maya. So it's an important philosophical point, but continuing with this slide, here's the quote from Nietzsche. It is not enough that you understand in what ignorance man and beast live. You must also have and acquire the will to ignorance. You need to grasp that without this kind of ignorance, life itself would be impossible. That it is a condition under which alone the living thing can preserve itself and prosper. A great firm dome of ignorance must encompass you. So the will to ignorance, man and beast, would not be able to live were it not for the illusions that keep us going. He's referring in part to Immanuel Kant. When Nietzsche said that man and beast require ignorance to live, he was referring in part to Immanuel Kant, who, following David Hume, pointed out that space, time, and the idea of cause and effect, which constitute the framework of our experience of the material world, are themselves not empirically observable material things. You can't see, smell, touch, taste, or hear space, or time, or causal links between events. And that indicates that space and time and causality are lenses of cognition through which all of our sense perceptions are filtered to our conscious mind. We have no idea what the world is like in itself, says Immanuel Kant, because all of our experiences of sense perceptions of the world around us are filtered through these psychological lenses of cognition, which are not outside of us, they are the mind. I pointed out earlier that if space and time are the mind, are lenses of the mind, then the mind naturally expands, because space-time expands because of the dark energy of the quantum vacuum. People experience that during near-death experiences. They feel their consciousness float above their body and then accelerate gradually until it's hurtling through space down a dark tunnel toward a point of infinitely loving and all-embracing light, which is what a person would see according to relativity theory if you were traveling at near the speed of light through space, or if you were enduring the gravitational tidal flow just in front of the event horizon of a black hole. And the point at the end of the dark tunnel is the gravitational singularity. It's one of the most precise parallels between psychology, or parapsychology, with near-death experiences, and physics, in this case general relativity and special relativity. So we require these illusions, space and time, and cause and effect. If we didn't perceive things in the context of space and time and causality, if all we saw were waves of probabilities, then we'd get hit by a bus, we'd step off a cliff, we'd trip down the stairs, we wouldn't see the world around us. The world around us is an illusion created by our own a priori categories of thought, but we need to have them in place or we wouldn't survive as the physical forms we perceive ourselves to be, which are themselves illusory. But in addition to that fundamental illusion created by the a priori categories of thought, space, time, and causality, Becker's saying we need higher illusions. We need to believe that the entire universe was created and that history is guided by an all-loving, all-powerful God. If our survival depends on that, or at the very least if our flourishing as a human being, if what Carl Jung calls individuation, becoming a complete and whole person, depends on this belief, then the problem becomes, how can you convince yourself to believe something that is an illusion? And again, I'm arguing that the parallels between psychology and physics, culminating in the Psyche equals Singularity equation, enables us to embrace the illusion, the eternal illusion of the reality of God. Continuing with the slide, the holographic horizon of the cosmos is the great firm dome, which the Hindus call Akasha, of eternal illusion, Yogamaya, from which the temporary illusion of nature, Mahamaya, is projected. Yogamaya is the collective unconscious home of all of the archetypes in which all religions are rooted. So we will be analyzing Yogamaya and Mahamaya at more length when we analyze the cosmology of the Vedanta philosophy. But if Mahamaya is made of, or refers to, what Immanuel Kant called the a priori categories of thought, space, time, and causality, and that is a correlation that Friedrich Nietzsche made in his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, and he was following an earlier German philosopher, Arthur Schopenhauer. So if Mahamaya is space, time, and causality, and we live within the illusory world created by those lenses of cognition, and if the material world reflects the spiritual world, then Mahamaya should be reflected by some kind of categories of thought in the spiritual world, spiritual space, spiritual time, and spiritual causality. One way to interpret the idea of a spiritual causality is synchronicity. Meaningful coincidences, where things don't occur in a linear sequence, A causes B, but rather A and B are related to each other symbolically. These are complicated philosophical concepts, but what I'm trying to convey here in this slide is that it's okay to embrace an illusion because as an individual's subjective point of view, that's all you ever experience. If you want objective truth, you'd have to lose your subjective consciousness. Brahman, I guess you could say, is objective truth because it's not perverted by any individual's subjective perspective. The union of those opposites, which the self-archetype must contain, being defined by Jung as the archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites, would be God, who unites every subjective point of view simultaneously, thereby achieving an objective point of view. But at any rate, we're trying to psych ourselves up to take this leap of faith in God, and if that requires adopting some form of spiritual illusion, then we should do so confidently. And it helps us gain confidence that we need to do that when we realize we are already living in the material illusion within the framework of space, time, and causality. God is an intelligible sphere whose center is everywhere and circumference nowhere. So we're talking about the great firm dome of ignorance that must encompass the human being if we want to survive and thrive. And I equate that great firm dome of ignorance with the horizon of the cosmos, where all of the archetypes are superimposed holographically at each point. The description of the holographic horizon of the cosmos that Susskind and 't Hooft gave us is based on a more fundamental concept of the Riemann sphere, which we'll be discussing in a moment. But first, I'm going to read this quote from Joseph Campbell's book, The Masks of God, Creative Mythology, in which he discusses how that ground of general relativity theory has been circulating through the Western mind for at least 900 years. So here's the quote from The Masks of God. It might be said, in fact, that the principle of relativity had been defined already in mythopoetic, moral, and metaphysical terms in that sentence from the 12th century Hermetic book of the 24 philosophers, God is an intelligible sphere whose center is everywhere and circumference nowhere, which has been quoted with relish through the centuries by a significant number of influential European thinkers, among others Alan of Lilly, Nicholas of Cusanus, Rabelais, Giordano Bruno, Pascal, and Voltaire. In a sense, then, our recent mathematicians, physicists, and astronomers have only validated for their own fields a general principle long recognized in European thought and feeling. According to Jung and his partner Wolfgang Pauli, the laws of physics mirror the laws of psychology and vice versa, because they're all rooted in the same archetypes of the collective unconscious, all of which are rooted in the archetype of the One, also known as the Self archetype and the God archetype, or the Unus Mundus. And furthermore, Jung said that the collective psyche of a group of people follows the same psychological laws of development as an individual psyche. Previously, we discussed Jung's concept of individuation, how usually in the second part of life we have to withdraw ourselves from the collective demands of society and the instinctive demands of our species and establish ourselves as a unique individual in relationship with the supreme archetype of the self. And by embracing that archetype, surrendering ourselves to that archetype, we can then re-embrace the two opposing sides of our collective life, and that's a state of wholeness through the union of opposites, or individuation. So the mathematical family of mathematicians, that group of people, has a developmental process that mirrors the developmental process of the individual. And when an individual is torn by opposing demands, the archetype of the self compensates that individual by presenting it with mandala imagery in dreams and fantasies and moments of inspiration. And those mandalas are like signposts through the wilderness that leads you towards the union of opposites. That occurred in the field of mathematics with the discovery of the square roots of negative numbers. I talk about that in my book, Psyche and Singularity. I didn't get into the details in this class because we're focusing more on the hero's journey, and it just seemed to be taking us a little bit too far afield. But I'll read a little bit from my book to describe this intelligible sphere whose center is everywhere and circumference nowhere. So we've already been discussing how the singularity, the gravitational singularity, is omnicentric. No matter where you are in the universe, it will appear as if you are the center from which the entire universe is expanding. That makes sense if we equate each psyche with the omnicentric singularity. But I want to read a little bit about how the mathematics of the square roots of negative numbers helped to develop the mathematical model upon which Einstein superimposed his theory of general relativity. So in the book, it's a chapter or a sub-chapter called Riemann's Mathematical Mandala of the One. And I start by quoting Jung, who says the psyche of a people is only a somewhat more complex structure than the psyche of an individual. Then I get into the evolution of mathematics, beginning with the discovery of the square roots of negative numbers, which was Giordano Cardan in 1545 in Renaissance Italy. Wolfgang Pauli was especially enthralled with the power of what's called the unit circle on the complex number plane, and I equate that with Jung calls the axiom of Maria, which he says, here's a quote about the axiom of Maria: "The problem that runs like a red thread through the speculations of alchemists for 1500 years thus repeats and solves itself, the so-called axiom of Maria, the Jewess or Copt." And this is the axiom of Maria. Out of the third comes the one as the fourth. So if you look at what's called the unit circle on the complex number plane, it progresses through 4 phases in a circle from number 1 on the real number line, which is the horizontal number line of the Cartesian grid. Everybody has seen René Descartes came up with the idea of the Cartesian grid. It's named after him, of an x-axis and a y-axis that creates a numerical grid upon which you can perform geometrical calculations. Well, the square root of -1 is an imaginary number because there is no way to find the square root of a negative number, because even 2 negatives multiplied by each other comes out to a positive number. The square root of 4 is 2, because 2 times 2 is 4. But the square root of 4 is also -2, because -2 times -2 equals 4. Well, what's the square root of -4? There isn't one, unless you imagine one, and that is what they did with the idea of imaginary numbers. I didn't get into the details because they're complicated, and it pushes the extremes of my understanding. But the point is, a multiplication by an imaginary number causes rotation. A 90-degree increment of rotation. So if you multiply the square root of -1, which is I, by 1, by 2, by 3, by 4, creates a circle. And that is a perfect mandala. And that unites the opposites of real numbers and imaginary numbers, negative numbers and positive numbers. It just seems to consolidate Jung and Pauli's theory that mandala images guide the psyche toward a union of opposites. And I've said before that black holes unite the opposite languages of quantum mechanics and general relativity in nature's geometrically perfect mandala. So the discovery of imaginary numbers was 1545 by Cardan, and then in 1831 Carl Friedrich Gauss gave imaginary numbers a geometrical expression on the Cartesian number plane, resulting in the unit circle like I just talked about, with these 90-degree counterclockwise and clockwise rotations. And he also developed the mathematics of multiplying and adding and subtracting and dividing these complex numbers, but there was a problem. You couldn't divide them by infinity because it would send one of the lines out to infinity. It was a big problem. And then his student, Georg Friedrich Bernhard Riemann, who lived from 1826 to 1866, he came up with a way that you can divide these imaginary numbers, which when united with real numbers are called complex numbers. And what he did was he rolled up the complex number plane into a sphere with the North Pole point representing a point at infinity. So reading from the book here, Gauss served as Riemann's doctoral advisor at the University of Göttingen, awarding him a PhD in mathematics for his 1854 lecture, The Hypotheses Which Lie at the Foundation of Geometry. In his book, Poetry of the Universe, A Mathematical Exploration of the Cosmos, Robert Osserman, who was the former chair of the Stanford Mathematics Department at Susskind's own Stanford University, Osserman says Riemann's 1854 PhD defense is the moment that, quote, we now see clearly in retrospect as marking the birth of modern cosmology. So that's why I'm taking some time to read some of the details here. Michio Kaku, in his book, Hyperspace, writes that on June 10th, 1854, a new geometry was born. So then I discuss how when Einstein was trying to render Newton's theory of gravity consistent with Maxwell's theory that light moves at an absolute speed, no matter how fast or slow you or the source of the light are going, you will always measure the same light beam, or any light beam, as traveling at exactly the same absolute speed. Well, if that's the case, and nothing can go faster than light, then Newton's theory of gravity must be wrong, because it implies an infinite speed of gravity, or instantaneous contact between two gravitational masses. So while he was trying to figure that out, he started losing his mind because he couldn't find the proper mathematical tools to help him describe his own theory of gravity. So reading here from Cosmos and Psyche, he pleaded to his mathematician friend Marcel Grossman for help. "Grossman, you must help me or else I'll go crazy." And then Grossman accidentally, this is a quote from Kaku's book, Grossman accidentally stumbled on the work of Riemann, so that's Riemann's 1854 lecture, and then he found a line-for-line correlation with Riemann's mathematical mandala of the number 1. In Kaku's words, the physical reinterpretation of Riemann's famous 1854 lecture is now called general relativity, and Einstein's field equations rank among the most profound ideas in scientific history. So this idea of the intelligible sphere whose center is everywhere and circumference nowhere finds its mathematical expression in Riemann's hypersphere, the Riemann sphere, upon which Einstein grafted his theory of general relativity, from which was derived the idea of a gravitational singularity and the horizon of the cosmos. String theory combines that theory of general relativity with quantum mechanics, so that the central singularity is also found at each point of the horizon of the cosmos, and that the past, the present, and the future of our universe are conserved specifically at each point of the horizon of the cosmos. But the circumference is really nowhere. According to Susskind's 3 principles, he has the holographic principle, which says that the information in any volume of space is recorded holographically at the 2-dimensional surface area. And then he has 2 other principles, which are the principles of black hole complementarity and cosmic complementarity. When you're looking at information falling into a black hole or towards the horizon of the cosmos, you see it slow down and the string structure of each particle smears out around that horizon, either the event horizon of a black hole or the inner surface of the cosmic sphere of the universe. But if you were to follow that information past the event horizon or past the cosmic horizon, then you would notice that it is irretrievably lost from the observable universe. You can't get back past the faster-than-light contraction inside a black hole or the faster-than-light expansion of space-time outside the cosmic horizon. So that's mutually exclusive but complementary perceptions of the same event. That's black hole complementarity and cosmic complementarity. So the circumference of the universe is there from one perspective, because if you go past it, you can't get back into the universe. From another perspective, it's not. There's different ways that you can interpret this maxim that has been a red thread permeating Western thought for at least 900 years, and that is God is an intelligible sphere whose center is everywhere and circumference nowhere. So we move now to Pascal's pensées. Nature is an infinite omnicentric sphere. Tobias Danzig, a historian of mathematics whom Einstein respected, lists the 17th century Catholic theologian and mathematician Blaise Pascal as one of a trinity of mathematical forefathers of modern physics, calling them the Great Triumvirate: Descartes, Pascal, Fermat. So Tobias Danzig was a mathematics professor at the University of Maryland in the 1930s, and Einstein read his book, Number, the Language of Science, and commented favorably on it. In that book, he discusses how Blaise Pascal and René Descartes, as well as Fermat, but we've discussed Descartes, we will discuss him at greater length later, and Pascal were both also Catholic theologians. So Pascal wrote a book, Pensées, or Thoughts. It's a series of maxims, short passages in which he contemplates a particular philosophical thought. And in one of those maxims, he says, nature is an infinite sphere whose center is everywhere and circumference nowhere. In short, it is the greatest perceptible mark of God's omnipotence that our imagination should lose itself in that thought. So of all of the perceptible marks of God's omnipotence, the greatest one of all is the claim that nature is an infinite sphere whose center is everywhere and circumference nowhere. So he was writing in the 17th century. He wasn't thinking of Riemann's hypersphere, and he certainly wasn't thinking of black holes and the inside-out black hole universe described by string theory. And yet, each of those steps forward in the progress of mathematics and physics reiterates this fundamental claim that nature is an infinite sphere whose center is everywhere and circumference nowhere. The center is the gravitational singularity, which I'm equating with the self. Just keep in mind that the equation Psyche equals singularity is a translation of Carl Carl Jung's own equation, Psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space. The highest intensity of energy is infinite, the smallest space is zero volume. That is the definition of a gravitational singularity, and the physics of general relativity and quantum mechanics and string theory indicate that point of infinite density is everywhere. It's at each point of the quantum vacuum, it's at each point of the cosmic horizon. No matter where you are, you perceive yourself to be the center of an expanding universe. You are a gravitational singularity. So the center is everywhere, the circumference is nowhere, because wherever you are, you perceive yourself to be the center. You'll never be at the horizon of the cosmos, at least while you are embodied in a physical form. But then when you leave your physical form during a near-death experience, you feel yourself expanding out with space-time at an accelerating rate until you find yourself out at that point of no return. So as we progress through this class, I'll be drawing in the things we've learned already and tying them all into this moving frontier towards the complete accumulation of all of the evidence which should give you confidence to make this leap of faith in the omnipotent God before whom you can perform your cosmic heroics. God is a point traveling everywhere infinitely fast. Continuing with Pascal's Pensées, earlier we heard Pascal ask, do you believe it is impossible for God to be infinite and indivisible? Yes. Very well, I will show you something infinite and indivisible. It is a point moving everywhere at an infinite speed. So as we discussed earlier, a point moving everywhere with infinite velocity would return to each point of space an infinitely increasing number of times at each instant. If we analyze that idea in terms of general relativity, the infinitely fast point would be a singularity, because acceleration is equivalent to gravity. A point traveling everywhere infinitely fast is the same as a point of infinite gravity, which is a gravitational singularity. So he's equating God with a gravitational singularity, a point traveling everywhere infinitely fast. Continuing in Pensées, Pascal says, I want to show him, the skeptic, a new abyss. I want to depict to him not only the visible universe, but all the conceivable immensity of nature enclosed in this miniature atom. These extremes touch and join by going in opposite directions, and they meet in God and God alone. So in that aphorism, number 199 in one translation, number 72 in another, he says, if you contemplate yourself, you'll find yourself between two abysses of infinity. The abyss of that which is infinitely large, you can expand out in space forever and ever, he says, but you can expand just as far inward to the smaller and smaller scales. They both go out to infinity, and they meet in God and God alone. They meet in the gravitational singularity, which is a point of infinite density. It contracts into itself at an infinite rate. It's infinitely small and it's infinitely big because it's omnipresent, or more specifically omnicentric, which brings us back to his idea of a point moving everywhere at an infinite speed. We just see how the unfolding of mathematics points to the same conclusions of theology, which makes sense if mathematics is this intermediary realm between mind and matter. Carl Jung believed that numbers are especially good at intermediating between physics and psychology because they have symbolic representations in psychology, such as the axiom of Maria that we discussed earlier, and they also describe the movements of physical objects. Pascal's wager. This is also in Pensées. I call it Pascal's wager 2.0 because I'm putting it in the context of holographic string theory and the equation Psyche equals singularity. God is unextended, yet everywhere. So as a preface to this wager, Pascal explains, all right, so the wager is you have to wager whether or not God exists. That's the ultimate human decision that must be made. And as a preface to that, he's saying there's no way we can know what God is, and here's the reasons why. Thus, we know the existence and nature of the finite because we too are finite and extended in space. We know the existence of the infinite without knowing its nature, because it too has extension, but unlike us, no limits. But we do not know either the existence or the nature of God, because he has neither extension nor limits. If there is a God, he is infinitely beyond our comprehension, since, being indivisible and without limits, he bears no relation to us. We are therefore incapable of knowing either what he is or whether he is. So Pascal was a very devout Catholic. He did believe in God, but his point is that reason cannot prove God's existence to you. He had another famous maxim in Pensées, which is that the heart has reasons of which reason knows nothing. We know this in countless ways. So his point is you need to believe in God, but reason cannot bring you there. Pascal's wager 2.0, the singularity is unextended, yet everywhere. Like God, the infinitely powerful singularity has neither extension nor limits, and is therefore not only unobservable, but incomprehensible, as physicists admit. If you'll recall Max Tegmark from MIT, he said, I could predict that a pink elephant with purple stripes would come out of the black hole, and that would be correct, because they don't predict anything. In other words, it wouldn't be incorrect to say that anything could come out of a black hole, because the numbers are infinite, which means anything at all could come out of there. However, the predicted mirror symmetry between Jung and Pauli's descriptions of the mandala-producing God archetype and Susskind's descriptions of the singularity and its holographic horizon tilts the odds strongly in God's favor, despite, and in large part because, Susskind presents his theory as the antidote to God. So we can't be absolutely certain using reason that God exists or that God doesn't exist, but I'm saying that this wager becomes easier to make, and it seems more likely that God does exist when you include the predicted mirror symmetry between Jung and Pauli's descriptions of the God archetype as this mandala-producing image that draws opposites together, and Leonard Susskind's holographic string theory. And you see the extreme parallels between Jung's near-death experience description of the cosmic horizon and Susskind's description of the cosmic horizon, and Jung's model of the psyche, which is a mandala with a central point that contains all of the energy that also includes the periphery, and Susskind's idea of the gravitational singularity, which exists at each point of the infinitely hot holographic horizon of the cosmos. These parallels are so precise, and they were furthermore predicted by Jung and Pauli, that this wager seems to have now, because of this parallel between Jung and Susskind, more evidence on God's side. That's why I call this Pascal's wager 2.0. Reason will never be able to prove anything definitively. We talked about the Munchausen trilemma. Any attempt to prove a first principle upon which to base an argument runs into one of three problems: the infinite regress, circular reasoning, or the necessity of asserting a self-evident truth. But we talked about how the psyche equals singularity mirrors that Munchausen trilemma and thereby neutralizes it. So at any rate, we need to take this leap of faith, says Kierkegaard. Pascal says we need to make a wager, and I've been arguing that the psyche equals singularity equation should make that wager easier to make, should make that leap of faith easier to take. Pascal's wager 2.0, endeavor to convince yourself. So here is what we're going to read now. It's taken from Wikipedia, except for the comments in brackets, which I included. So this is Pascal's wager. The wager uses the following logic. Excerpts from Pensees, Part 3, Section 233. God is or God is not. Reason cannot decide between the two alternatives. Recall Kierkegaard and the infinite regress. A game is being played where heads or tails will turn up. You must wager. It is not optional. Let us weigh the gain and the loss in wagering that God is. Let us estimate these two chances. If you gain all. If you lose nothing. Because anything finite, no matter how great, recedes into nothingness compared to infinity. So that's an important point. He says if you gain all. If you lose nothing. If you bet that God exists, and God does, you win everything. You win infinite bliss. If you bet that God exists and God doesn't, you haven't lost anything. Well, I would say, well, yeah, you have. Maybe if you bet that God doesn't exist, then you'd allow yourselves to have some more physical pleasures in life, and at least that's something. Whereas if you bet that God exists and God doesn't, and you live the life of an ascetic monk, well, then you have forfeited what little pleasure you could have had. But in Pascal's reasoning, when you compare anything finite, no matter how great, to the infinite, it recedes into nothing. So if you take, for example, I've seen videos looking at the sizes of different stars and the sizes of different black holes, and they compare them and they zoom out each time for the next bigger scale. At first it looks big, our sun. Then you compare it to the next sun up on the size scale, and then by comparison, our sun looks a little bit smaller. And so on until our sun recedes to a single point. Well, if you go out to infinity, that point recedes into relative nothingness. So the finite compared to the infinite is nothing. That's his point. So continuing here, wager then without hesitation that he is, that God exists. There is here an infinity of an infinitely happy life to gain, a chance of gain against a finite number of chances of loss, and what you stake is finite. And so our proposition is of infinite force when there is the finite to stake in a game where there are equal risks of gain and of loss and the infinite to gain. So, given those odds, it's only reasonable to stake it all on the belief that God exists, because you have a chance of gaining an infinitely blissful and eternal life. Continuing here with the wager, Pascal says, but some cannot believe. They should then at least learn your inability to believe and endeavor then to convince themselves. Now that is quite a statement. Endeavor to convince yourself. Well, I don't believe in God. Okay, well you should, because there's no other way the human psyche can achieve wholeness and happiness and health. So that even if it's an illusion, it's the salubrious illusion our species requires, just like we require the illusions of space, time, and causality to exist in our three-dimensional holographic paradigm. There are other higher archetypes that we must also incorporate into our worldview, such as the wise old man, the wise old woman, the anima, the animus, all of these Jungian archetypes, which we'll be discussing throughout this class. Endeavor then to convince yourself that God exists. Is it possible to convince yourself of something that you think is a lie? It's a good question, and what Pascal says is, well, just start doing the rituals. Pretend you believe. You'd be surprised how you can habituate yourself to believe something. So I am saying in this class, I do believe God exists. But even if God doesn't exist, then it's still a wise choice to endeavor to convince yourself that God does exist for all of the reasons we've been discussing and will continue to discuss. And meditating on the equation Psyche equals Singularity and all of the evidence that supports it will help us a lot on that quest to take this leap of faith, to deny that we will ever die, to believe that we are eternal, immortal heroes performing on the cosmic stage for an all-powerful, all-loving God. Essence of the human condition. Cultural illusion is the heroic dimension. So coming back to Becker's book, The Denial of Death, cultural illusion is a necessary ideology of self-justification, a heroic dimension that is life itself to the symbolic animal. So Becker says the human being is a paradox combining the animal body and the symbolic self. The symbolic self is our self-awareness. It's what separates us from the animals. We have access to infinity through self-reflection. Animals are aware, but they're not aware that they are aware. Humans are aware of our own awareness. That's self-reflection. Like two mirrors facing, it opens up a portal to infinity, but it also opens up the door to dread and the fear of death. Once we realize we are a self who expands and extends into infinity, then we fear the death of our infinite self when the body dies. This whole class is entitled Immortality and the Unreality of Death, so we need to be able to believe that we will not die when our bodies die. If we believe that we will die when our bodies die, then we have no chance of living a full human life. We have no chance of achieving individuation. We have no chance of becoming a true hero, according to Becker's definition of a hero as a servant of God. Continuing with the slide, the cosmic mandala formed by the omnicentric singularity and the all-encompassing horizon is the heroic dimension that is life itself to the symbolic animal or psyche, because it is the psyche, as the Vedic, Christian, Platonic, and many other cultures have affirmed throughout the ages, as we will see. Nietzsche on the need for metaphysics. So Nietzsche, some say Nietzsche, some say Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche, famous for saying God is dead, and yet at the same time, I believe he included in his books hints about his belief in God. He was raised the son of a Lutheran pastor, and up until the age of 20 was a very devout Christian, preparing to become a Lutheran pastor himself. Then he renounced God at age 20. I've been writing papers arguing that at age 25 or so he came back around and believed in God again, although in his middle and late period books, he says God is dead. He claims to be the prophet of the Antichrist. My theory is that he's trying to draw the Western mind back around to God, away from God, into atheism, back around to God, the same cycle of progress that he himself had fulfilled. But that is a topic for another class. Reading here from his book, Human All Too Human, he says, a few rungs down. One level of education, itself a very high one, has been reached when man gets beyond superstitions and religious concepts and fears and, for example, no longer believes in the heavenly angels or original sin and has stopped talking about the soul's salvation. Once he is at this level of liberation, he must still make a last intense effort to overcome metaphysics. Then, however, a retrograde movement is necessary. He must understand both the historical and the psychological justification in metaphysical ideas. He must recognize how mankind's greatest advancement came from them, and how, if one did not take this retrograde step, one would rob himself of mankind's finest accomplishments to date. With regard to philosophical metaphysics, I now see a number of people who have arrived at the negative goal that all positive metaphysics is an error, but only a few who climb back down a few rungs, for one should look out over the last rung of the ladder, but not want to stand on it. Those who are most enlightened can go only so far as to free themselves of metaphysics and look back on it with superiority, while here, as in the hippodrome, it is necessary to take a turn at the end of the track. A hippodrome is a circular or oval racetrack. So Nietzsche's saying you need to overcome the childish, superstitious belief in God and angels and the idea of sin and salvation. And then you need to overcome the more abstract concept of metaphysics, which is just the belief in some enduring ground of being. However, once you've done that, then you need to come back down a few rungs, which would seem to lead us back to belief in God and angels and original sin and the laws of karma and things like that, which is what I believe Nietzsche himself had done. This idea of coming back down to believe in illusion again, it's important to keep in mind the two types of illusion according to Vedanta philosophy with which Nietzsche was enamored. Mahamaya is the temporal illusion consisting of the categories of thought, space, time, and causality. But there's a higher level of illusion, Yogamaya, the eternal illusion. For a while at the University of Hawaii, 2008, 2009, I worked at a Govinda's food trailer. And I asked somebody once, thinking of Yogamaya and Mahamaya, I said, what's the difference between an eternal illusion and an eternal truth? Because they both exist eternally. And it was just a paradox. I didn't receive any memorable answer from anybody, but the point is Yogamaya, the spiritual illusion. These spiritual forms are eternal. According to this Vedanta philosophy, each of us has a spiritual form, a spiritual bodily form in one of the 8,400,000 species that exist, according to that philosophical tradition. The spiritual form is made of eternal knowledge and bliss. It's an actual form, each part of which has the consciousness of the entire form. And these spiritual forms interact with the form of God and Goddess, Vishnu and Lakshmi. And there's different forms of Vishnu and Lakshmi on each of the eternal spiritual planets, all of which are made of Yogamaya. These eternal spiritual forms. So the eternal spiritual illusion enables a soul, according to Vedanta philosophy, to interact personally with God and with other spiritual forms in interpersonal relationships. The lack of illusion would be the lack of subjective perspective, which would be the lack of personality, and they call that Brahman. It is objective truth in the sense that it lacks all subjective opinions. So that's a fundamental philosophical point that we'll keep in mind, but here Nietzsche's saying, okay, you've used your logic and you've overcome these superstitious religious beliefs, you've overcome even your belief in some kind of a eternal ground of being, like Schopenhauer talked about, the underlying will, which was his interpretation of the Vedic concept of Brahman. Now you need to come down a few rings and believe in God again. That's what I am arguing. I believe God is real, but what's the difference between an eternal truth and an eternal illusion? If God is the archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites, then God will be the eternal truth and the eternal illusion. It's just a concept that will help us make this leap of faith when you start questioning, well, isn't it kind of crazy to believe in a personal God who's infinitely powerful and yet somehow has some personal interest in me? Maybe it is kind of crazy, but if so, that's the kind of divine madness that we seek as the highest goal of life. It's certainly something Plato said in the dialogue, The Phaedrus. Nietzsche on the need for cultural illusion. God gave it, the forefathers lived it. According to Nietzsche, to convince people to accept a religion, you must convince them of two things. And here's a quote from his book, The Antichrist. God gave it, the forefathers lived it. So he's pretending to be an atheist, I argue, or you might argue that he is actually an atheist, but he's analyzing the history of religions, and he says the only way you can get people to believe a religion is to convince them that God gave it and the forefathers lived it. So I argue that if Psyche equals singularity, as evidence suggests, and if that equation represents Plato's idea of the good, also known as the God archetype of the collective unconscious, as Jung describes it, and if that ultimate archetype is the source of all religions, then we can state honestly that God gave us the Psyche equals singularity equation, and our ancestors lived according to the religions that presaged it. People can remain faithful to any particular religion and still see the emergence of the Psyche equals Singularity equation as a symbolic manifestation of God, with roots stemming from and leading back to Plato's original academy. We need a collective immortality ideology. We must welcome a living illusion. Going back to Becker's book, The Denial of Death, he's talking about the psychologist Otto Rank. He says, "This is Rank's devastating Kierkegaardian conclusion. If neurosis is sin and not disease, then the only thing which can cure it is a worldview, some kind of affirmative collective ideology in which the person can perform the living drama of his acceptance as a creature. Neurosis is the contriving of private obsessional ritual to replace the socially agreed one now lost by the demise of traditional society. The modern neurotic must do just this if he is to be cured. He must welcome a living illusion. It is one thing to imagine this cure, but it is quite another thing to prescribe it to modern man. How hollow it must ring in his ears." Now I write, the main obstacle on the journey to become cosmic heroes in the eyes of God is the seemingly impossible task of getting our proudly polarized and pluralistic society to take a collective leap of faith into a miraculous mythology only a primitive could possibly believe. So after this slide, I'm going to go over the Vedanta philosophy and theology of India, and then I'll go over Plato's cosmology as presented in his dialogues. And after that, I'll trace out the evolution of Western philosophy leading up through Hegel to Carl Jung, and we will also be talking about Joseph Campbell's book, A Hero with a Thousand Faces. But analyzing this section from Becker's book a little bit, neurosis is a private obsessional ritual. The way to cure neurosis is to embrace a collective immortality ideology that the whole society embraces. But we don't have that anymore because science seems to have disproven the ancient religions. I've been arguing that the evolution of physics in the 20th century, from special relativity to general relativity to quantum mechanics, ultimately to holographic string theory, brings us full circle back to Plato's cosmology, as well as the Vedanta cosmology of India. Although we might not all be able to embrace one particular religion, we can embrace the idea that Psyche equals singularity. I think that is an idea that the modern scientific mind can embrace. Is that sufficient to satisfy the human psyche, who demands incarnate intermediaries between our material world and the spiritual world? Probably not. You need to have an actual fleshed out images of God and the spiritual intermediaries. Nevertheless, the Psyche equals singularity equation provides a cosmological and psychological framework within which to interpret the various religions. And at the very least, we can see how the Psyche equals singularity equation evolved from the ancient religious traditions, specifically from the Platonic tradition, which was interwoven with Christianity in the Western world. And it should give us the confidence required to take the leap of faith that Kierkegaard requires of us. Spiritual expansion into the truly fantastic. A new take on the old collective drama. Continuing with Becker's book, he says, "But faith asks that man expand himself trustingly into the non-logical, into the truly fantastic. This spiritual expansion is the one thing that modern man finds most difficult, precisely because he is constricted into himself and has nothing to lean on, no collective drama that makes fantasy seem real because it is lived and shared." We will now see how the collective drama of the history of philosophy has brought us full circle back to the Vedanta philosophy of ancient India and Plato's Greek philosophy, both of which presage and flesh out my academic claim that each of us is a gravitational singularity, the truly fantastic point of infinite constriction and expansion that breaks the logical laws of physics from which it emerged like the shell of an egg. I hope you are enjoying this hero's journey into the realm of philosophy, psychology, and physics. If you want to help me create more content like this, please subscribe and consider sponsoring me here on YouTube. You can also click the link to my website, psycheandsingularity.com, to sign up for a multiple choice test with over 100 well-crafted questions related to this class, and links to the specific parts of each video where the answers can be found. If you take that test to the end, you will receive a certificate indicating that you have become a Psyche and Singularity scholar. In addition to access to that test, there is also the opportunity to answer essay questions that ask you to relate concepts covered in this class to your own hero's journey. I will personally respond to each of those essays, point out any other parts of this class that I think might bolster your plan. Finally, I want to point out that this course is sponsored by the Platonic Mystery School of the Divine Infinite Being, and you can check those guys out at divineinfinitebeing.com.